So in this video, I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of influences to this setup that I've got going. I'm going to be adding an influence to the eyebrow, as well as I'm going to be adding some joints in for the nose that I didn't add before, but it's not a big deal because I can, like I said, I can add influences later. Now, for the eyebrow, I'm going to be using a different setup that we have not used yet before. This one's going to involve using curves to actually influence the skin. So what I'm going to be doing is creating a curve that kind of follows his brow and setting up some clusters to control that curve, which will in turn control the skin. A cluster is basically just, it's hard to explain, but it'll look like a little letter C, and what it does is it controls components. It's a deformer, much like blend shapes are, but it acts in a much different manner. So what I'm going to do is grab my CV curve tool, and I'm going to set it to linear. And I'm going to turn on my wireframe here. And I'm going to hold down V as in Victor on my keyboard and start tracing along the edge loop just above his eye. Okay, so 1, 2, I think I might have missed that first one. Let me try again. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 right there. And I'll hit enter. Looks good. I'm going to center the pivot on this and just move it away from the skin a little bit so that it's a little bit easier to grab later on. That looks good. Perfect. So I'll now freeze its transformations and rename it. Again, I'm using my hotkey for freeze transformations. So this I'll call C influ for curve influence, L brow 01. And eventually we'll have one obviously for the right side. As a matter of fact, I might as well just go ahead and do that now. I don't see why not. So I will duplicate that, group it, flip its scale X to -1, and then unparent it and freeze its transformations. Get rid of that group. And rename this to the right one. That way it's got the exact same position on the left and the right side, which is perfect. Alright, so now I'm going to apply the clusters to this. Currently this really does nothing. So we're going to have to go ahead and apply some clusters and reweight them. So I'm going to go ahead and have that left one selected, and I will go to cluster under create deformers. Okay, so as you can see, it creates a little C. And if I move that, it will move the curve. Yay. We're going to be adjusting it later so that it doesn't control the whole curve, but it will control each CV in a different manner. Now I got to add a couple more clusters to this. I want 3 in total. So I'm going to select the curve again, and I'll just hit G to create another cluster, and one more time. I just want to check one thing because I may have forgotten an option. I did. Let me remove those real quick. This is easy. I forgot one little option on our cluster. Okay, so I'll select it again, cluster, but I want to turn on relative. Okay, and select it again, hit G, select it again, hit G. So I've got my 3 clusters, which is great. So I'm going to now have to position these because I want one for the inner part of the brow, I want one for the middle part of the brow, and I want one for the outer part of the brow. And the way you do this is by first adjusting where the cluster's handle is, and that's what the C is. So I need to go to my attribute editor for this. So I'll take that first cluster in my attribute editor. If you go to the shape node, cluster 1 handle shape, I can now change these values under origin. And the way I'm going to do it is just by holding down control and clicking in each of these boxes. These translate to X, Y, and Z. So if I adjust them ever so slightly, you're going to have to look at this in a bunch of viewports here, but move it out. If I use my left mouse button, that is actually the slowest speed that it will translate it at. And it looks like I can't see everything, so let me get my view cube up here. Where is it? There we go. A little hard to see. Alright, so I'll adjust this by hand. That looks pretty good for the X and Y. And the Z is a little too far forward. That should be good right there. Okay, So that's the inner one. The next one, I'm going to try and match it to this CV right here because that's the middle one. I went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that will be the middle. And I'll just have to move it a little bit in X. And forward in Z. And you can punch in values, obviously, over there. I'm just using the quick entering, or using the dragging method to make it go a little bit quicker. And that should be okay. It's more about the pivot than anything else, but we'll be adjusting that in a second. Alright, and then the last one. I'm getting very picky here. Alright, that should suffice. Alright, so now I need to adjust their pivots real quick because currently they're all back here where they started, and again, each cluster right now controls each CV at 100%. So we don't really want that. We're going to be fixing that in a minute. I'll name these real quick. This will be CL underscore L inner brow 01. This one will be mid brow, and the last one will be outer. Now you can obviously name them differently. You can just go ABC if you want to, which is just fine. I'm just being a bit more specific for the purposes of the video so that you know which is which. And it looks like I'm a little bit off on that outer one. Not a huge deal. I can just adjust that. Okay. Alright, so now that we got that, I need to adjust their pivots. And the way I do this is just like you would adjust any other pivot. Hold down D, as in David, and this time I want to snap the pivot to the curve. So what I'm going to do also is hold down C, as in Charlie, and I'm going to middle click on the curve, and you want to angle yourself so you can really see the curve here, just like I've done. So hold down D and C, middle click on the curve and hold, and you can just drag that pivot right over to where you need it. Now obviously I want the pivot to be as close as possible, so I'm using the CVs as a guide for where to place them. This is the inner cluster, so I'm going to put the pivot right by that. Alright, do this again. For the second one, there's that cluster right there with the CV that's right next to it for the mid-brow. And then for the outer, there you go. Okay, so now I can at least move them nearby. Now the next step that I want to do is actually control how much these clusters can control the CVs on the curve. So what I'm going to do is go to control vertex mode and just select those 5 CVs. And I'm going to use something that I don't think I've used in these videos yet, but I'm going to use the component editor. And it went off my screen. Hang on one second. Alright, so what you want to do is go to the weighted deformer tab, and that's where it'll list everything that's controlling those CVs right now. Since the CV is a component, that's what we're seeing. And what I'm going to do is tell each of these clusters how to control that curve, and basically just weight them by hand. Normally we're used to weighting by using the paint weights tool, but since this is a curve, you wouldn't exactly be able to paint weights on that curve. It'd be very difficult. So I'm just going to enter them in by hand. So basically, they should be able to control the CVs that are closest to them much more than the CVs that are farther away. So if that's the case, and by the way, if you don't know, on a curve, the first point is identified by the CV that has a square. The end point would just be a regular point like this one. So if we look at these numbers, we have CV0 to CV4. CV0 is obviously going to be the start point, which means it's the inner one. So in that case, that means the inner cluster is going to control it the most. And we can see here's the inner brow cluster. I can make these a little longer if you want to see the full name. There we go. And you can see it's 100% controlling each CV right now on each cluster. So we're going to change that. We're basically going to make it a little bit less, and it's going to degrade as it goes further and further away. So I might start with, and I found, you can play with these values as much as you want, but I found that some of the best results come with something like 0.8. The next one would be 0.6. The next one would be 0.4. 0.2, and 0.1. And that's basically how you would control the first cluster. So what I can do is just show you what this does now. Instead of just grabbing every CV and moving it in the same amount, now it's going to degrade. So you can see that it's controlling that first one far more than that one in the back, which is exactly what I'm looking for here. Oops, hang on. There we go. So what I can do now is actually take those numbers and kind of pretty much just reverse them for the outer brow cluster, which is over here, because I want the outer brow to control the endpoint in the very same manner, and then as it gets to the start point of the curve, it will get weaker and weaker. So this 0.8, 0.6, 0.4, 0.2, 0.1, I can just reverse it for the outer brow cluster. So I'll just punch these in by hand. 0.2. This one will be oh, wait, I'm sorry. This was 0.1. 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, and 0.8. And pretty much the exact same thing will happen on that end, and I'll just show you for the sake of the video. There you go. Okay, and just to show you a difference, this is what the mid-brow does right now. Controls every CV in the exact same manner. There is no weighting on that one, other than 100%. So now for the middle one, it's basically going to control CV2 strongest, and then it's going to degrade outward. So this one's a little bit different. You're going to have to decide how much it should control each one. But what I think I've used in the past is something like, for CV2, because that's the one right next to it, right there, it'll control it at like 0.7. The next one's out, which would be CV1 and 4, or 3, sorry, will be something like 0.3, and then 0.1, or a little bit less for the last one. It just depends on what you find you like. Again, for the sake of the video, I'm not going to sit here and worry too much about that. Yes, I'd like it to be perfect, but as long as it does what it's supposed to, I'm happy. And there you go. You can see the difference between before and after. Okay? So, now that our curve is weighted, we can now go in and actually add this to our skin as an influence. So in this case, it's not going to be a joint affecting the brow. It's going to be this curve, which is awesome. So what I need to do to add this as an influence, and I'm just going to do the left brow for this because the right brow is the exact same method. What you do, you select the skin first because it's already been skinned, and that's very important to adding an influence like this. It has to be skinned first. So I'm going to select the skin and then select that curve. And I'll go to Skin, Edit Smooth Skin, Add Influence. And I want to go to the option box for sure because I just need to make sure that there's two things selected. So in there, first thing, do I want to use geometry? Yes, I do. Because I'm using a curve, which is geometry, that is going to be the influence as opposed to a joint. So I want that on for sure. Now, the drop-off and polygonal smoothness, that doesn't really apply to us in this case because what we're going to do is lock the weights. Turn that on, leave it at 0. Basically what we want is that when we apply this as an influence, we don't want it to control anything. We don't want Maya to take weights from anything else that we've already gone in and painted. So this will start it from 0 and then we can add to it. So, having done that, again, make sure you select the skin first, then the curve, and hit Add. And now, if I grab a cluster, nothing happens still. Well, there's a good reason. We just added it with a locked weight of 0, meaning it has no possible control over this yet. So I'll go in and block in some very, very quick weights, just 100% on there, and I'll show you how to do that. Under the Paint Weights tool, you'll notice all the way at the bottom of our list we have this new influence, See Influ Brow. Sound familiar? And it has a little lock next to it because we told it to lock the weights. So you just select it and hit unlock right there. And now I can go in, I'll just, like I said, block it in right on that same line. Make sure your influence is selected and just, oops, I had it set to 0.3. So now I want it at 1, so I can just quickly block that in. And there we go. We'll go in and refine that obviously in just a second. But I want to grab my cluster now and show you what happens. Wait, Nothing's happening. Well, there's a good reason for that. It's a very simple thing. We didn't really set up the skin to know that it was going to have influences like this. So we have to tell the history on the skin that it will be allowed to use other types. Basically, it's going to be allowed to use components to also affect its surface. In this case, the components of that curve. So if I select the skin and go under the Skin Cluster 1 node under his inputs, I'll click there and you'll see this little attribute that says Use Components. Turn that on, and now when I grab that cluster, oh my gosh, it's a miracle. It is actually moving the skin. So now what you can do is you can go in. Actually, I'll apply some keyframes to this real quick, and you can see. Okay. So it is moving, but it's very blocky right now because we haven't done any refining of the weights. So I'll go in with my Paint Weights tool. I will use Add with a low value like I always do. Make sure I'm on the right influence. Yep. And start adding stuff to the surrounding area. And this is where you get to have fun refining your weights. And don't forget, we're going to be adding weight later for the eyelids, probably in the next video, to be honest. I don't really have a set order for some of these things because it can be done in a variety of different ways. But I'm going to go ahead and just kind of flesh these out a little bit. Okay, getting there a little bit at a time. And a good reference for this is actually having a mirror on your desk so that you can see kind of what actually moves. You look like a weirdo sitting there raising your eyebrow over and over again, but it does help because you can have all these nice little spots where the skin will slide, and it just looks much, much better overall. Oops, sorry. My mouse wheel on this computer is very, very sensitive, so it tends to go all over the place. Alright, so let's see what that looks like in smooth. Not too bad, actually. I'll add a little bit more here and there. Hopefully you guys are enjoying watching me paint. I think I'm just going to smooth this corner a little bit. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, so now you can see the eyebrow working. And what I would do from there is basically remove the keyframes off of that first cluster, and I would go to the next one and do the exact same thing. Now you can do them all at once, but I tend to prefer to go one at a time. It's just my preference. So you'd set more keyframes and lift it and just check. Because obviously, you know, the clusters are controlling the curve, but the curve is ultimately what's controlling the skin. So we're only painting on one object. We're just being able to manipulate that one object in 3 different areas. Okay. That's actually not too bad. I think I want to pull this one up a little bit more. Get in here. Oh, I'm smoothing. That's why it's not working as well. It would help if I added, right? Everybody does that same mistake, so don't worry. Okay, getting better. Okay, just check it out. Looking good. Or at least decent. And then you check the last one, and it's pretty much the same thing from there. But I'll go ahead and do that just for the sake of having it in the video. Actually, that looks pretty good. Yeah. I'd probably spread it a little bit more into the temples, but I think that's actually pretty decent for now. So, now you would basically do the exact same thing to the other side. You would start by creating the clusters, moving them around so that their handle actually matches. And the easy way to do that, to make sure it matches on both sides, these values under the shape node, it's pretty much the same thing on both sides. The only difference is whatever's in the X for the left side clusters, you just make it negative and put it on the right side. So just for an example, let's say I wanted to mimic that first one. I will create a cluster on my right curve, and this is going to be the inner one. So I'll rename this. I might still have it pasted. I do. There we go. So that is the right inner brow. Don't worry about that. That happens every now and then. So I'll look at the other inner brow and check out its values. We've got 0.037, 5.841, and 0.005. I'm going to start with X. So I'm going to copy that, go over to the other one, and paste it. But since it's on the other side of the model, I'm going to have to make just the X negative. And that's it. Everything else will be exactly the same. So I'll go back, copy the Y, and then go back to the left side, and grab the Z, and paste it. And now you can see our clusters match. So you would do this 2 more times. And weight the clusters by going into the component editor, and then you would add it as an influence in the same way as before. You definitely want to lock the weight at 0, but this time, since you already have the left done at this point, you can just use mirror weights. The weights will mirror from one influence to the other, so you'll end up with the exact same thing on each side. Now the only other thing I want to do real quick is add the ability to move the nose. The way you do that is just by adding a couple of joints in this case. So what I can do is I'll just grab my joint tool and create a single joint right on the tip of the nose. Just holding down V and snapping it to the vert, and then I'll move it inside. Just check it in the side view to make sure it's got a nice position to it. Yeah, that's good. Alright, and then I will also make some for the nostrils. And what I do for this is fairly simple. I'm just going to grab my joint tool again. I'll snap to the vertex right here, holding V, and creating a joint right there. And then I'll go and snap again to the outer side of the nostril. So I'm going from the almost the septum to the outside of his nostril. Again, holding down V. And that will automatically orient this joint. And this way, I can take this and just scale it, use that to flare the nostrils later. The only thing I want to do is also reorient this. So I can just set Y and Z back to 0, and now there it is. And again, that was under the joint orient in the attribute editor. I'm going to shrink these joints really quick. Let me try 0.1. Yeah, that's perfect. So I'll name these joints. This will be BNJNT nose 01. And this will be BNJNT L nostril 01. I'll copy that because the next one after it is going to be a BE joint for the nostril. And there we go. So basically, I'm going to take these, the roots of these, which is that BN joint and the nose joint, and parent those to the upper jaw, which is right here. So I can just select that bone in the middle, or I can drag it up in the outliner, whichever way you want. Those get parented under the upper jaw so that when I will rotate that, it will go with it. And eventually, yes, we'll fix the eyes and in the next video, I'm going to be doing the eyelids and the eyes. So I'll show you how to just organize all that stuff. I don't want to go too far over 30 minutes in each video. Alright, so I'm going to take this BN joint for the nostril. I'm going to mirror this over because I know I'm going to need that. So I'm going to go to skeleton, mirror, and this is the part where I always forget which one I need. It is not orientation, so I'm going to use behavior. There we go. So now I can take these both and scale them using X, and they'll both go at the same time. Okay, so now I've got both nostrils, I've got the nose. I can add these influences in the very same way that I did before. So I'm going to select the BN joints, which are the root ones. I don't want those BE joints. Those were really there just to angle the BN joint. And those three, actually I'm going to go to the skin first, I forgot, and then select those three. So L nostril 01, nose 01, and R nostril 01. And I'm going to add these under add influence. The only thing I'm going to change though is I'm going to turn off use geometry, because this time they're joints, they're not geometry. So lock weights at 0 and add. There we go. And if we go to my paint skin weights tool, you'll see I now have 3 new influences that are locked. So I'll select those 3, hit the unlock button, and now I can start painting on them in the exact same way. I think at this point you guys kind of get the method to my madness, as it were. I'll set some keyframes. Okay. And then I'll go back to paint skin weights. And where'd it go? I lost the nose. There it is. So now I'll go ahead and add some weights to it. Let's say I just use replace with 1 and start blocking it in the same way we're already used to, and you can see that it's going to start moving. So from there, this is where you're going to start refining it. Use add, low value, however you like to do it. It's fine by me as long as the weights come out good. So I'll start tweaking. So that it will look nice. But at this point, I think I'm good. I think I can stop the video from here, and you guys can practice on this. But now you have the joints for the nose, you have the influences for the eye, or eyebrows, and in the next video, we're just going to continue with, working on weights for that stuff. I'll probably have some weights done before the next video. So you'll see that there's going to be a significant improvement probably in my weights for the nose and the eyebrows and stuff like that. But that's something that you can work on outside of the videos at this point. And we'll work on the eyelids in the next video. So until then.